Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's meeting of the Scrutiny Commission. As usual, this meeting is being broadcast live to the public. For those who are not able to watch live, the webcast will be recorded and made available for viewing on the County Council's website after the meeting. So, moves to item 1, which are minutes of the meeting held on the 13th March 2024. I move these are taken as read, confirmed and signed. Is that agreed? Okay. Item 2 is question time. I've not received any questions from the public. Item 4, urgent item. Simon.
Standard one about being members of district councils in view of some of the items on the agenda.
Just to say, I think there probably Mr. Richardson will say the one as former director of the LEP, whether that's a declaration or not that's needed, I don't know.
Okay.
Chair, I don't think it's necessary, as the discussion today is going to be focused on the County Council's perspective rather than District Council perspective, for you to make those declarations.
Okay, thank you. Item 6, declarations of the party whip in accordance with overview and scrutiny procedure rule 16. Do any members wish to declare the party whip? No. Item 7 is presentation of petitions under Standing Order 35. Okay, it seems as if some of the microphones are playing up a bit. Right. Okay, so item 8 is the first substantive item, which is transition of the Leicester and Leicestershire Enterprise Partnership, the LEP responsibilities to upper tier local authority control. Tom Purnell, the Assistant Chief Executive, is introducing the report, and lead member Mr. Bedford has also joined us for this item. So welcome, Mr. Bedford, and Tom, please go ahead. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. The report updates the Commission on the transfer of responsibilities from the Leicester and Leicestershire Enterprise Partnership to the two upper tier local authorities, that's the County Council and Leicester City Council, in line with the decision taken by government. The LEP board, on which Mr. Bedford has been director, and you've heard that Mr. Morgan and Mr. Richardson have also been directors too, has supported this transition. The government's decision to cease funding to LEPs from this April was confirmed last August, when initial guidance was also issued. And the government also stated that for a number of key functions, namely business representation, strategic economic planning, and the delivery of government programmes where directed, that funding would be provided to upper tier local authorities in those areas where there isn't a combined authority. Key extracts from the government guidance are set out at paras 6 and 7. The LEP board resolved to work together with the two upper tier local authorities to ensure a smooth handover, and a transition board was established with membership of several private sector LEP directors, the LEP chief executive, and senior officers from this council, Leicester City Council, and the representative of the district councils. Further guidance was issued by government in December 2023, which added further detail on business representation and local economic planning. The new arrangements were considered by Cabinet last month and are summarised in paragraphs 11 to 22. They include the priority economic development activities which will be supported. These have been informed by the government guidance and also by the availability of funding. The decision-making arrangements and the establishment of an advisory business board with representation from key stakeholders, including business, district councils, universities, FE colleges, and the voluntary and community sector, to advise the decision makers being the two upper tier local authorities. The arrangements have been designed to fully comply with the government guidance and are summarised in paragraphs 14 to 17. Business representatives on the business board will be a combination of those nominated by representative bodies such as, for example, the East Midlands Chamber of Commerce, and other private sector members recruited through an application and interview process. And it's proposed that the chair of the business board will meet every 2 months with the city mayor and leader of the council. If I could just refer to paragraphs 18 to 21, which summarise specific interim arrangements being put in place to facilitate a smooth transition of the existing legal, contractual and financial arrangements affecting the enterprise zones in the county. In effect, this involves keeping the existing LEP company operating for a little longer whilst new arrangements are agreed. I won't go into any more detail on that at the moment, but some of that detail is in the report. And finally, if I can just summarise the financial aspects, which are covered in paragraphs 23 to 26. The government has indicated that it will provide up to £240,000 core funding in 2024-25. The precise amount is to be confirmed. That's slightly less if the full amount is provided than the LEP has received previously. It received £250,000. The LEP has left £2.8 million in reserves. Some of that will be needed to fund transition costs, and some will be used to fund the priority activities up to March 2026. And the precise amount required for that will depend on government funding made available as core funding, as just mentioned, but also for specific activities such as the Business Gateway Growth Hub, where a decision on government funding is still awaited. And finally, the Growing Places Fund. This was a low rotating loans fund which has supported a number of projects across the city and county. That currently has a value of £10 million, and that is available for the new arrangement to support economic development investment across Leicester and Leicestershire in the future. So that's what I wanted to tell you by way of introduction, Chair.
Thank you, Tom. Mr. Bedford, did you want to make any comments at this point?
Thank you, Tom, for that comprehensive introduction. Just a few brief words from me, just to thank really Andy, Reid and Anil for co-chairing the board over recent years. I know that they've had a lot of difficulties in terms of delays in government announcements in the new transition period. So I'd like to put my thanks to them on record, and also Phoebe Dawson for taking that forward. The LEP has achieved a lot of good things for Leicester and Leicestershire over the last 13 years, and I'm confident that this new body will continue to focus on the priorities that Tom outlined. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bedford. So I'm going to open up to comments. Obviously, as was mentioned previously, the main aim of this discussion is taking it from the county council perspective rather than the district council perspective. Mr. Richardson, do you want to come in at this point?
Move. So if you only said, no, perfectly happy. I mean, I look at paragraph 2, and I don't think all of us who've supported that strategic plan are fully behind it. That what we want is a strong economy for Leicester and Leicestershire, and in that respect, the government have made its decision about how some of the functions of the previous LEP are to be tackled going forward. I suppose what concerns me is how we as the county council can actually develop, because it's not covered in here, that partnership with our second tier partners who actually are responsible for economic development. And I would have thought, when you look at what has happened in other areas across the country, they very much have not gone the model that we've decided to go as Leicestershire. They've set up an economic growth board, which has business and district councils represented there. And I see no purpose personally in having a business board that then reports through one person to Nick and Sir Peter, whereas I would have thought Sir Peter and Nick, certainly Nick on our behalf, representatives, would have been better off hearing the discussions in that board, which should be an economic development board, not a business board. And I just wonder firstly why it is that we've taken a different route than what I've seen reported. And I can only go on what's reported from most of the other areas of the country where they've gone for an economic growth board. And we are still, unless Tom tells me otherwise, a member of an economic growth board, because I don't think the economic growth board we're a member of has ever actually been discontinued, which was the pre-runner to the members advisory group. And And in fact, there is a synergy here where you have something similar to members advisory group as an economic growth board as an adjunct then, because it then brings in strategic planning, which is coming in with economic development. And I suppose the second point as well about, I suppose from the point of view of our divisions and the impact on the economy in our divisions, it would be nice to have a bit more granularity on how we see the £10 million being used. You know, are we able as county councillors to actually put in applications for it on behalf of local businesses, etc. So I see no understanding in this report of how that's going to work. I appreciate it's early days and these things might need to be worked out, but I just always fear sometimes if we don't get these things in at the start, they never actually appear anywhere. And, you know, how are we going to look at what the arrangements are going forward on how we can ensure that economic development and prosperity is spread across the county, and because we're all concerned about the impact in our own divisions, and therefore it would just be to have a better understanding. And so they're the two questions to start with.
Thank you, Mr. Richardson. In terms of the approach that's been agreed locally, I mean, I think it's fair to say that there's been a range of different approaches across the country, and in other parts of the country, I think the conversations have been much more difficult than they've been in Leicester and Leicestershire. Actually, big disagreements about what the geography should be. There have been quite difficult relationships in some areas historically between local authorities and their LEP board, and we haven't had those problems by and large in Leicester and Leicestershire, which has been a really, really positive thing. The intention is that that district councils are fully involved alongside other stakeholders, including the business community, universities, you know, FE colleges and the VCS. And in addition to you know, being represented on the new business board, you know, there is already significant involvement of the district councils in the various LEP subgroups, which will be integrated into the new arrangements. There's a requirement made by government that district councils will need to be involved in the development of a new economic strategy, and certainly my expectation would be that a task group of some form will be set up to carry out that piece of work, and that district councils will be definitely involved within that. I think it's just felt that, you know, with the decision-making responsibility being given to the two upper-tier local authorities, that all of the other partners have a really important advisory role, and it's best to treat those partners equally in terms of their involvement in a board. And I think there was a desire not to recreate the LEP board, you know, which is sort of a fairly large group of people, and to do something in a slightly different way. Now, I know that that's been controversial. It's not necessarily the approach that some partners would have wanted to take, but that's the decision that's been taken. In terms of the granularity of how the £10 million will be spent, you're absolutely right that more work needs to be done on that. I think a key piece of work will be either the creation of a new economic strategy, economic growth strategy, or a local economic plan, whatever we decide to call it, or indeed an updating of the existing one, which covers the period 2020 to 2030. And I think the government has stipulated that it will expect either a new strategy or an updated strategy to be submitted within, I think, 6 months of receipt of the funding, and when we don't know how much that will be, but when we do get that, hopefully fairly soon, then we'll need to be submitting something. And I suspect it makes sense to spend most of that £10 million when we know what the strategy moving forward is, rather than deploying that in advance of that. Of course, there may well be some pressing things that it's decided to invest that in a shorter timeline.
Thank you, Tom.
Come back.
Yeah.
If I can to you, Chair, just thanks very much for that, Tom. And I totally agree with what you said about the advisory board, which we declare in the business board. And that was my contention then, that we then have our leader and Sir Peter are the decision makers, not sitting hearing that advice. They're getting the advice from one representative of that body, which won't actually have the nuances and information which I would have thought certainly Nick would want in the decision-making process. And therefore, rather than have a separate group here in the business, but if Nick and Sir Peter sat on that board, fully understand, as the government has outlined, that we are one of the two decision makers, but I would have thought that hearing that, I would want my leader to hear that advice, to make the best decision rather than being reported to by one person on behalf of the whole board, obviously with the benefit of minutes, one would assume, and that would just then save an extra meeting because they could be in that meeting and have it done. And it's that two meeting, but I still don't understand.
Just on that, and I could have covered this in my initial response, and it's not covered in the report, but as mentioned in the report, it's stated that the city mayor and leader will meet with the chair of the business board. I think it says 6 times a year or every 2 months. I don't think a final decision has been taken, but my expectation is that the city mayor and leader of the council will also want to meet with the business board, perhaps twice a year or something like that, to take part in that sort of full debate. So I think that will cover off, at least to some extent, the point that you've made there, Mr. Richardson.
Mr. Frisbee.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Through you, I'd just like to ask 2 questions around paragraph 15, if I may. The business board will be chaired by a private sector. The detailed process for setting up the business board is under development. Do we know when that development will conclude and when the board will be constituted? And can I further ask you, what methods of transparency will there be for businesses to actually interface with that? Where will membership or opportunity to join membership of that board, where will it be advertised? Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Tom.
Sorry, I've actually got a meeting with colleagues tomorrow where we're talking about the timeline for that and the indication in that, and obviously it needs to be worked through and agreed amongst everybody, is that the board would meet for the first time towards the end of June. So that's the plan. Clearly, in advance of that, there needs to be the recruitment of the members of that board, and, for example, preparing terms of reference for that group, and also, if you like, job descriptions for the board members. So that's work that's in hand. And so that's the sort of timeline that we're expecting. And sorry, your second question was?
No, sorry, Tom. Where will those opportunities be advertised, and where will they be visible for people who feel they could contribute to the business board? Thank you.
Yeah, two aspects to that. I think key business representative bodies like the Chamber and other bodies of that ilk will be invited to nominate somebody to join the board. And I think we'll almost certainly carry out a similar process as was carried out for the recruitment of private sector LEP directors. So that's to advertise the opportunity and make sure that the key organisations in the media are aware of that, so that there's wide publicity of that opportunity.
Mrs. Page.
Thank you, Tom, for all of that. But I'm very confused, and I hope you can clarify a couple of items for me. Now, you keep referring to the decisions have been taken, etc., etc., and indeed this report has been to cabinet. So I'm not quite sure what value scrutiny will bring and how we're going to take our comments forward. Now, my question here, that is a question, but then who makes all of these ultimate decisions in the first place? Because, we're sitting here and saying the decision of this has been taken, this decision, and there are knots all around. So if you can talk me through that, please. So, and when these final decisions, whoever makes them, being taken, what influence have we got as a county council? And again, correct me if I'm wrong here. As I always understood it, economic development sits within the district remit. I never thought that the county actually has a legal responsibility for economic development. So how, if I'm wrong, and how do you see the role of the county council to facilitate all that? And my last question is, we were just talking about the 10 million, which the city is holding. Now, again, I can't get my head around it. So what will happen if this 10 million runs out? Where will this body get the funding from? How will, I can't, so if the body only has 10 million, and gets no further funding, then all of this was pretty useless because they can't do anything without money. So just, work me through it. And yes, I think that will do for now. Thank you.
I'll try to take all of those in turn. I mean, obviously, it was the government that made the decision to transfer the responsibilities explicitly to upper tier local authorities. So the guidance makes that absolutely clear.
So if I may interject, so it has taken the responsibility of economic development away from districts or just the running of the boards?
No, it hasn't. And I think certainly all of the time that I've been at the county council, that both the district councils and the county council have had economic development functions and have had teams which have supported economic development. And you can argue that many of the sort of the main service departments have an important economic development role at the county council. Investment in transport, for example, is absolutely critical to the economy, but we've always tended to have a corporate economic function at the centre, which has helped coordinate that, has liaised with bodies like the LEP and before that EMDA, and has sought to secure government funding. So that's always been the case. And obviously the districts have had their own economic development functions. We've worked together on many of those things. Something like the Town Deal Board's a good example of where the county council is the member of a board that is district council led. Sorry, the Loughborough Town Deal Board, I should have made clear. Some of the decisions were agreed through the LEP Transition Board around, for example, what the priority activities would be, but with the responsibilities transferring the specific responsibilities of the LEP transferring to the two upper tier local authorities, obviously the decisions now rest with the City Council and County Council working together, but obviously recognising that the impact that the City and County Councils can have on the economy is only part of the overall impact that public sector partners and business will have on the economy as a whole. So that's why it's really important that we do work in partnership. So I think you want.
Okay, so yes, to just come back. So then, because of the government guidance, the responsibility to make decision lays with the upper tier and the city only. So then how in the decision process feature scrutiny and suggestions we are making, how can we feed in, or what value do we give to the process?
Well, in effect, the functions become part of the activities of both the City Council and the County Council. So, for example, around performance management, the activity should be picked up through the annual delivery report and the performance compendium and other performance management arrangements that we have at the County Council, and the opportunities there for the Scrutiny Commission to scrutinise the activities that are carried out in a similar way, I guess, to the Place Marketing Organisation, which again is a joint City County Council operation. There's a team hosted at the City Council that deliver those activities, and there's an annual report to this commission which enables you to scrutinise that. So that's something that you may want to continue to do in relation to the new economic development arrangements, which are being jointly delivered by those two councils.
So in effect, if this commission then would say that we would like to have proper performance indicators and set them, that can be featured into the process. Yes?
Absolutely, and I'm sure that will be the intention, that when we've got an updated economic growth strategy, that will have performance indicators as part of it.
And previously, I've also mentioned that a communication protocol, how and the flow chart cannot be added to it. So we're all quite clear who's got to communicate with whom and how we can feed into. And then remember my $10 million question.
Yes, on communications, we've inherited from the LEP their current comms approach. I think there's some external support which has been engaged by the LEP, which is still in place for another couple of months. And I know that comms colleagues here at the County Council will be discussing with the City Council about how we lead the Commons work moving forward. I think I agree with you. You know, communications is going to be absolutely critical. It's been critical to the work of the LEP in the past because there's a big diverse business community out there, and it's really hard to get to them all. So we do need to try and make sure that we get that right,
as well as internal. So we all get that has got to be part of that.
No, absolutely. I agree internally as well. On the £10 million, so could you repeat the question on the £10 million?
The question was, we've got £10 million in the pot. So is it just sitting there or will it be spent? Because that is, you alluded to. But if this 10 million runs out and there is no other money coming in, so again, how do you see alternative monies coming in unless the government gives grants, etc. So I just don't understand how this body will work if the 10 million runs out, no money comes in, because then it renders the whole process redundant.
Yes, no, thank you for that. That we are expecting that government funding will continue for some of the specific activities that are previously carried out by the LEP, but which are transferring into the new arrangements. So, for example, the Careers Hub, which is part of the National Careers Enterprise Company Network, and also the Business Gateway Growth Hub, the government has indicated that it intends to continue funding those. We don't precisely know how much that is, but also the three functions that the government said it was transferring. One was around business representation, one was around local economic planning, but the third one was delivering government programmes as directed. So I think what we can expect is that that the government will ask these new local arrangements to deliver specific programmes on its behalf, as indeed the LEP has in the past. So that's where we would expect future funding to come from. Of course, if the financial situation were to improve and the City Council and County Council and other parties wanted to put some additional funding in, they could, but we know how difficult that might be in the current climate.
Mr. Golden.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so could you just establish a few understandings of how it's going to work? So does it have any planning powers?
No.
Okay, that's fine. Will it have access to business rates top-up funding?
And though more recently, the LEP hasn't had that responsibility, but of course that is a responsibility that the county council, city council, and district councils have jointly to agree around business rates. So that's something that would continue as it would have been previously, I think, and is effectively unchanged by this. There is also the issue of the retained business rates at the enterprise zones, and that's something that will be considered through the discussions that I mentioned a little bit earlier.
Okay. Is it envisaged that it will just give grants, or could it actually deliver a scheme or a project? Is it just grant giving, or could it actually manage a programme?
I think it is likely to be both. Depending on the decisions that are taken, the government may provide funding, for example, to deliver a grant programme specifically, or it may be decided to use some of that £10 million to deliver a grant programme. But again, it could well be that it's invested in specific projects or in specific programmes.
Okay. And will it? You mentioned how it would work at decision making. Will it have to operate under the normal local government access to information rules? So there'll be agendas, there'll be minutes. So I'm just understanding, does it operate like any other committee, or do the two leaders operate outside of that,
Yeah, no, that's my expectation. There is some guidance on that, and I must admit I'd have to go back to answer that definitively. But ultimately, I think any of the decisions that the city mayor and leader of the council made would any substantial decisions would need to be agreed through the formal decision making processes of the two councils in any case.
It will be reported back to the relevant cabinet.
Yes, absolutely.
An outcome. Yeah, because I was going to ask, what if they couldn't agree?
Well, I mean, hopefully that wouldn't happen. But I think that detail will need to be picked up in the sort of the formal decision making process in terms of reference that are drawn up in the next 2 or 3 months. That hasn't actually been done as yet.
Okay, thank you. And then in paragraph 22, where you say we're still working on this non-mayoral level 2 devolution. In the event of the deal being agreed, the economic development arrangement will become part of the combined authority. So is that saying that if there was new combined authority, the powers would transfer from the leaders to this body?
That's right. So the arrangements in Leicester and Leicestershire are being put in place because we don't have a combined authority. If there was a combined authority in our area, then the government would have transferred the responsibilities to that combined authority. So the expectation is that any new combined authority would, these arrangements would be absorbed into that.
Right. So it could be temporary, depending on
it. No, indeed, it could be temporary.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Chair. So we established quite a bit there. I mean, the one that I find strange then is the planning powers. It doesn't have planning powers. Those planning powers still with the local planning authorities for this. So I just think we're not going to get the best out of it. If presumably a grant will be dependent on all planning and any licensing and all that sort of thing being in place. It just seems to me we're unlikely to get the best out of the body if the planning authorities aren't got a seat at the top table, but that's just my view. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Barclay.
Thank you, Chair. No, my question's already been answered actually just now. Thank you.
Okay, so Mr. Morgan.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just a couple of comments on structure. I'm assuming, I mean, likewise, following on from the last question about transition to level 2 or whatever. I mean, the question is actually how interim is this interim arrangement? Because clearly, the next government, whichever it may be, will probably have a continuing view on devolution and the powers that devolved bodies will be given. And clearly, there's a lot of discussion within the current government and also within the opposition about deepening those devolved bodies. Now, I'm assuming that as a result, this is an interim type position that we're in. We're obviously not a level 2. I'm assuming we only get the UXBAR money. Is it UXBAR money that comes with a level 2 arrangement rather than necessarily the current arrangement? So as far as the sort of future income stream that Mrs. Page referred to, there's some pots of money, but those tend to be ring fenced, such as the Careers and Enterprise Company, etc., which I need to declare because my wife is actually chair of, and it has been referenced. I didn't realise it was going to come up as a reference point. But those sort of funding pots are clearly, are sort of semi-ring fenced, and therefore, whilst we may manage, we don't necessarily get to actually define the expenditure on some of those pots. But where for the county and the city to actually really benefit, then the income stream that comes from sizable sort of lumps of money and also sort of powers and negotiations with other authorities to be able to direct the economic benefit to its maximum is quite important. So whatever comes next will come next. In the meantime, we've got obviously the structure that the government has bestowed on us. We have a sort of structure that we're determining. The business body advisory panel. I have to say the reason why I think we've probably got quite a lot of significant business people involved in the LEP is because they were decision makers, and actually to join a board where you're going to be a decision maker is attractive. To join a board where you are merely an advisor, I think is probably less attractive, and it may well be. I suspect that probably we're going to struggle potentially to get significant business leaders to commit time if actually they are literally just advising rather than decision making. and it's a subtlety that I think for a lot of people where they are time poor, that's actually quite a big decision for them. So it will be interesting to see how that process works, whether we actually get the same level of significant business leaders that we had around the LEP board versus an advisory panel will be interesting. The only comment I guess, and the question I have is about existing agreements. We're obviously ported across. City Council has obviously carried on being the sort of the regulatory body, statutory body, and is party to pretty well every single, whether it's a loan agreement, whether it's the EZ agreement, has been by default a signatory to all of those bodies anyway. And obviously, as a result, I suspect legally it's quite straightforward to carry on in the way that we are at the moment, because all of those agreements, whether it's my money coming in through loans or whether it's by EZs generating income streams through contributions from business rates, the issue is I'm assuming there's absolutely no vested reason why we as a new party to those will want to reopen any of those agreements, because to be frank, as soon as you rely on parties coming together and actually having a new agreement, by default an agreement is two parties actually coming to a settled view. And a bit like the question about whether Nick and Sir Peter actually disagree, the absence of disagreement means that there is no agreement. So by default, it's probably in our interest that we actually carry on with all of those agreements that have been previously signed by the LEP, particularly given that the City Council is continuing. And I say that because my County Council division includes the LUCEP element of the EZ agreement that includes the city and also obviously Loughborough Science Park at the university, which is within my County Council division, and obviously Charnwood Campus as well, which is at the moment, I think, the sort of along with some of the access building and also the City Council's areas, is probably the only contributory part to the business rate pool coming in through that particular EZ agreement. And I appreciate there is another EZ agreement elsewhere in the county area. So it's just really a question, which is, are we intending to actually reopen those agreements, particularly where they come with loans as well, part of the £10 million pot that Mrs. Page referenced, or are we happy to actually carry on with those agreements on the basis that they have been signed in good faith previously, and therefore will carry on providing hopefully a decent income stream for the County Council and the City Council's ongoing endeavours on supporting economic development.
No, thank you. On that final point, I mean, I think the intention is to maintain the agreements. To some extent, it's a technical issue. LEP Limited, the company is a signatory to those agreements, as is the City Council in its role as accountable body with the relevant billing authorities. And clearly, those agreements wouldn't remain legitimate if the LEP company was closed down. So we need just to make sure what the new arrangement is prior to LEP Limited being closed down. That's the reason why there's that extension of the life of the LEP company to enable that to happen. But I would expect that that it was quite a painful process agreeing those agreements, if I remember. So I'm sure everybody would want to keep that as simple as possible. I think there will be an issue about sort of complete transparency amongst all the partners of what the financial situation is within those enterprise zones. So before decisions are made, and just on devolution and the level 2 deal, I mean, I just agree with all your comments. It's an uncertain situation. When's the general election going to be? What's going to be the next government? What funding streams might be coming forward in the future? So the expectation is that this will be an interim arrangement, but it's hard to say at the moment for how long it will be that interim arrangement.
And Mrs. Hack.
Thank you. Just to follow on really from Councillor Richards' point, but also from others around business. And obviously we've gone from something that was a partnership to just local, to the city and the county now making the decisions. What what's come forward from business so far in terms of the the transition arrangements? How are they feeling about the change? What's been their view on it, and how's that come through the LET board through to transition?
Well, I can speak on in relation to the discussions that took place at the LET Transition Board, which I was a member on, but Mr. Bedford will have been at LET board meetings. So I think it's fair to say at the LET Transition Board there was a fairly what I would call sort of pragmatic approach to the transition in terms of just trying to make sure that it happened smoothly. There was discussion around what the priority activities should be moving forward. I think the private sector directors were keen to understand what was planned in relation to the LET reserves and the £10 million Growing Places Fund, and commitments be made that will be used for economic development moving forward. And I think there was sort of a variety of views about what the future governance would be. But I think it's fair to say at the Transition Board there weren't really extensive discussions around the government. That may have happened more also at the LET board.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so at the LET board meetings, there clearly has been some frustration amongst some members of the board around the way this transition's happened over the last 2 years. Government hasn't always been forthcoming with information in a timely manner, which has meant that we've ended up in the position we're now in. So that has been a frustration of business. But certainly speaking to colleagues around the boardroom table in terms of their perception of getting involved afterwards, there's certainly an appetite to still have a seat at the table, be it in a different governance arrangement. So I think as Tom mentioned, there is certainly a pragmatic view amongst business. They still want to be involved, still have that influence with the new structures. But as I say, I recognise the points made by many members around the room today around some of the frustrations about the timeliness of this, about the poor communications from government at times. So absolutely take that all on board. And I can only really thank the officers and members of the LEP leadership, and particularly Andy Reid and Anil, for persevering and driving this forward, because it has been a really frustrating couple of years with government announcements. But certainly, to answer your question directly, there's still an appetite amongst the business community to be engaged in this new structure.
And just following on from that is, what do we perceive and how will we prevent there being a lag between the current setup, the transitional setup, and the new setup? How will we navigate those waters from an economic development point of view? Business need consistency, and we've created a real set of inconsistent environments for them. So how will we negotiate that?
I think a key thing is that the operational activity is continuing. What was the LET team? There's been a staffing review, so there has been a slight reduction to the size of that team, but the former LET team still exists and is still carrying out the work that's been agreed as priorities. So the decision's been taken also to use the available reserves to fund those priority activities for the next 2 years. So all of that activity on the Careers Hub, on the Growth Hub, on the various skills programs, all support for the enterprise zones, all of that work is continuing, overseen by, it's sort of managed, if you like, at the City Council, but with the input of, myself and others in terms of overseeing that work. And obviously in time, fairly soon, that will start reporting into the new governance arrangement. So whilst I accept that there's probably some uncertainty for business about what the future governance arrangements are in terms of who's going to be on the business board and those sort of things, I think in terms of the work that's done on the ground, that there shouldn't be any sort of noticeable difference, I would hope.
If I may come back, thank you, Tom. I think this is a really, really good discussion, because there are so many points that need to be discussed. And personally, I think the more we're discussing here, the more information I seem to be seeking. And you've just were talking about that the present team is still working, but then we're talking, as we're saying, what is the future transition? So there'd be probably new criterias that have to be worked up, etc., etc. But just simply talking from the here and now, one of the things that concerns me going forward, it is if as the county we are a decision-making body, how and when will we set out a criteria? How are we going to overview? And as I mentioned it before, I probably would like to see a performance criteria and measuring against outcomes. So when will we be doing that? Another thing it is, how is, if the leader, whoever it may be at the time, how is he going to report back? So can that be a part of the communication protocol, which I've just mentioned? But one of the main things that concerns me is the transparency of the financial aspect. Because at the end of the day, whether the money comes in from government grants or whether, you know, we are putting in all the 10 million, how is that reported and scrutinized? Because there needs to be, I'm sure, an identified process where it goes to, etc. And my last question is, if it is a new body, will it still be called the LEP? Or will it have a new name? If it has a new name, what will it be called?
In terms of your first point around sort of performance indicators and future priorities and outcomes, as I mentioned earlier, there will be a need to produce a new economic growth strategy that will need to be signed off by the County Council's cabinet and by you know, and through the City Council processes. So there's an opportunity then for that to come to scrutiny. And then, of course, once that becomes a strategy of the Leicester and Leicestershire, it'll be subject to the normal performance management regimes. In terms of financial transparency, that's an issue in effect for the City Council as the host accountable body. So you know, they will need to be, you know, all the usual financial rules will need to be followed in relation to that funding.
But will the county council, because it's an equal partner, be also part of that and have an input in that?
Indeed, and that's certainly, you know, the case around place marketing, for example. We have sort of full transparency around the joint budget, if you like, around the place marketing activities. So that would absolutely be expected. And certainly one of my finance colleagues has been involved in the discussions that we've been having with the city around the future arrangements. And then in terms of the name, there hasn't been any decisions made on that. And I think we'll be mindful of the fact that this might be an interim arrangement, but I think it is understand what it is. So that is something that will need to be done.
Okay, any final comments, Mr. Richardson?
Thanks for me, Chair. Just coming back to the point Rosita made. I mean, I suppose it relates to the £10 million and decisions made on that going forward about, you know, is it going to be a revolving fund as it was previously? So is it going to be investing money to come back at the riskier end to enable things to be done? Because obviously the LEP used to have an investment panel which oversaw the loans, performance of the loans, etc. So I suppose my question is, what member involvement are we building in here, or was it be solely officer-led about monitoring any investments that might be made out of that fund jointly by us as the county and the city? And you know, because it would seem strange if there was no member involvement in this. And I suppose it's that transparency and how do we as members get involved in overseeing that process, because you know, you had a former system whereby the investment panel probably met every 2 months at the longest. You know, will there be something replicated at the time when we start to use that 10 million?
That's a sort of a detail that hasn't been resolved, if you like. One of the things I mentioned earlier is that the new arrangement, if you like, absorbs or integrates the existing substructure of the LEP. So I think that's one of the groups that the future, the future of that group will need to be considered, or a future of a group that carries out that function will need to be considered as part of the process going forward. So I can't really provide an answer to that at the current time, but it is something that needs considering.
Could I perhaps ask that we just note that, I personally, I don't know if other members would welcome member involvement of this council in that process, particularly if we decide to have, as I said, a revolving loan system as previously.
Thank you to all the members who contributed to that item, and thank you to Tom and Mr. Bedford for asking questions. Thank you. Brings us on to item 9, which is the refresh of Leicestershire County Council Planning Obligations Policy. Mark Johnson, Planning Obligations and System Team Manager, will introduce this report, supported by Julie Thomas, Head of Planning and Historic and Natural Environment. So over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Chair. I'm pleased to be here today to present the proposal for the refresh of the County Council's Planning Obligations Policy. The proposal includes conducting a public consultation on the suggested adjustments, and they're appended to and summarised within the report. Developer contributions is a term mainly used to refer to planning obligations, which are commonly referred to as Section 106 or S106 obligations after Section 106 of the Town and Country Planning Act. Developer contributions are planning tools that can be used to secure financial and non-financial contributions or other works to provide infrastructure to support development and to mitigate the impact of development. Developer contributions should be used appropriately and effectively, and to achieve this, they should be considered throughout the planning cycle. Now, the current policy was adopted following council approval in 2019, but since that time, there have been several national planning policy updates, including the National Planning Policy Framework, which has been updated twice, and the Community Infrastructure Regulations. And then internally, there have been changes in practice and methodologies used to calculate developer contributions, including the uplifting of cost multipliers for education, but none of these changes are referenced in the current policy. And in addition, going beyond that, some costings that are in the current policy haven't been updated for some time, going back as far as 2015. And refreshing the policy, as set out in the reasons for recommendation, will ensure that the County Council's approach in securing developer contributions is based on up-to-date evidence and costings. The purpose of planning itself is to achieve sustainable development and support sustainable economic growth. So it's important that any development to be sustainable needs to be in the right place with sustainable transport links and provide social and community facilities that local communities need that makes an essential and important contribution to their health, social and cultural well-being. And developments that fail to meet those needs run the risk of being unsustainable and fail the needs of the communities that they seek to create. So it's essential then that appropriate contributions are sought from developers to secure that sustainable development. So appropriate and sustainable, of course, also means financially viable to deliver. We all know the current housing and development market is volatile with sales low, but the prices of materials and labour are high and increasing. So the County Council must help local planning authorities maintain the balance between the viability of development sites in conjunction with the needs of the County Council, given those increases in population and the demands on infrastructure. And members will see that the remit of the policy, as set out in the report, does not extend to services which do not currently make a request for developer contributions, except with the addition of an appendix on biodiversity net gain, which is a mandatory requirement that's been introduced recently. So with that economic uncertainty and further changes expected from the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act, which in itself sets out its own proposal on developer contributions, it's not proposed that the remit of the policy is extended to cover county council services at this time, but a full refresh will be undertaken as soon as it's practical. In addition to referencing up-to-date national and local policies and the most up-to-date council policies where relevant, and the provision for biodiversity net gain, the policy sets out changes to methodologies and costings as set out in the report between paragraphs 14 and 21. At the 26th of March Cabinet, it was agreed that the Chief Exec could be authorised to make minor amendments to the policy before it's issued for consultation, and therefore part of my reason for being here today is to listen to your feedback on the proposals so that any amendments can be presented back to the Chief Executive prior to public consultation. And if any members would like to pick up separate discussions with me, I'm more than happy to do that too. The public consultation is proposed to run in May and June, and obviously that's to ensure that the views of the public and other stakeholders, such as the district councils and developers, are taken into consideration. We'll host the consultation online and we'll send it directly to key stakeholders as well as publicise it via the council's social media channels. And then following the public consultation, the policy itself will be formally drafted and presented back to both Scrutiny and Cabinet. It's expected that that be Cabinet in September and August for Scrutiny. And as the policy forms part of the authority's policy framework, the County Council will be asked to approve the final policy afterwards. Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Julie, did you have any comments to make at this stage?
Not at this stage, no, thank you.
Okay, so over to members. Mrs. Fryer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the presentation and document. The first thing that hits me is on page 36. It's about the travel packs, the bus passes, travel plans. I've been within this county council member since 2017, and I have raised this. When we're doing planning in the other places, and there's travel packs and bus passes, so many parts of the county now do not have buses available, do not have trains, do not have any other form of transport except their own 2 feet or a car. And I think also this is, to my mind, and many of my residents have commented on this, it's a complete and utter waste of time. It really is, because also there are the rules of how far away the development is from facilities. Now, I don't know how many people who have got a child at primary school, a child in a pram or pushchair, will walk 800 metres to go and walk that child to school or to the shops. They won't. I live in a large village and I see them. So I really do think this has to be completely, for the second quarter of the 21st century that we're now approaching, to say that people are going to use it when there just aren't the facilities. There aren't. I would love to go on a bus, but if it's not going to take me where I want to go, for me to get to Leicester, I have to go on 2 buses from a village that has 6,000 people living in it. So I do think the travel packs, the bus passes, would be better use of the money, actually. Thank you.
Thank you. So that's what the sustainable travel voucher, which is one of the proposals, sets out to be a bit more flexible on what that money can be spent on. So rather than it just being used for travel packs and bus passes, for the remit of that to be a bit more wider to help support sustainable transport.
With the greatest respect, Chairman, and yourself, what is sustainable transport? Would you please explain to me that if I can't get a bus and there isn't a train service and there's no facilities, say, in the village I live in, what sustainable transport would this suggest and be financed?
You make a good point, thank you. So I'll refer that to the sustainable transport colleagues so that we can come back to you on that.
Thank you. Mr. Galton.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. This is obviously quite timely. There's a paragraph in here says we haven't uplifted the multipliers except for education pupil cost multiplier for some time. And so we need to do that, absolutely, because obviously if we're not requesting the most up-to-date costs, then we're going to be losing out. What I'm wondering is that if you can only do that at the moment by revising the policy, you're going to have to revise the policy every time you know the cost of living applies personally. That must be happening, as you've said, regarding construction costs and our costs as well. Would it not be possible to write the policy in a way that allows officers to update the multipliers as and when required, maybe on an annual basis, or maybe when something significant happens, so that you don't have to rewrite the policy every time? Could I make that suggestion, Chair, that is looked at? Because it could be critical to something. We know what happens. I mean, it's the case now. It's very rare when we build a school that the Section 106 pays the full cost of the school. We still have this gap. And that's the case on a lot of highway issues as well. To get the mitigation that's really required, developers very rarely end up being willing to pay the full amount to get the mitigation. So the more we can do to meet that, I think we should do that. I welcome, although it's not clear yet exactly how it will look, but the addition of a section on biodiversity net gain. I think that's going to be really important, because I think it will be the case that, and it's possible where it's the case, if it can't be done on site, they can do it off site. Disappointed that apparently they could do it 50 miles away. Rather say that they have to do it at least close to the development, but that's going to be the rules as I understand it. But clearly, if it's going to be done off site, we need to make sure that this policy picks up any costs associated with that. Then in relation, we seem to be moving on bus, notwithstanding the point about whether there is a bus, but there are circumstances where it may be necessary initially to subsidise a route in a new development. Hopefully it will then become commercial, maybe not, but we hope it would be. But there seems to be a preference now. We're going to move towards asking the developer to provide that bus service, whereas currently I think they would make a contribution and then County Council would commission the service in the normal way. Could you just explain how that in practical terms would change, and how it would be secured that the developer didn't say, yeah, okay, we'll do that, and then 6 months later they decide not to do it? Got an example of that at the moment where it's changing and people think something's going to happen and then it isn't. And then just a very minor final point, you mentioned trees in the table. Can't find it just now, but there's a reference in the highways section on trees. Obviously a really important issue, small issue in the overall policy, but we've had a problem in recent years. The probably going to need to refer this to Environment and Transport, but they've Environment and Transport quite unwilling to adopt trees as part of the highway, because it then becomes an asset and that they were responsible for. But having a nice tree-lined entrance to a development, it really can make the difference in making it look nice. And I understand the NPPF is now actually saying that we should have street trees. So we've got a bit of a dilemma there, and I just think the policy is hopefully clear, but I appreciate that's Environment and Transport, but perhaps you could refer that back to them for an up-to-date position, whether they would, with appropriate contributions, would adopt street trees. Thank you.
I'll try and answer all those points. Forgive me if I miss one out. It would be desirable for the policy to be worded so that we can carry out an annual review to update any indices, etc. The situation we are in at the moment is that we know there's quite a lot of additional legislation coming from government through the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act and various other suggested amendments to legislation. And the decision was, do we take a review now, or do we wait for that legislation to come out? And the decision was taken is, well, we actually need to do a review now because of the reasons you've stated, where current contributions are not covering the actual cost of the services they're providing. With regard to BNG, we don't need to include BNG within our policy document because BNG is subject to separate legislation, but for clarity we are going to include it, so we'll make sure everything ties up with respect to that. Subsidised bus routes, where I've dealt with these elsewhere, it's actually in the 106 you would specify the level of service, the frequency of service, how long the service had to run for, and the developer to provide it. So it wouldn't be a matter of, well, 6 months down the line, we don't really think it's been used. It would be set out in that legal agreement, which would which couldn't be altered unless by agreement within 5 years of being entered into. So I think that would provide the security. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to minimise the risk to the county council. So as far as possible, we're requiring developers to provide the infrastructure and the services needed rather than ourselves. But the way Section 106s have traditionally been worded, it's a choice. But what we're finding now is that developers are choosing to pay their contribution on day one rather than when it's actually required, which means that we're not getting the indexation and we're not getting the true value of what's been provided. So we're trying to avoid that. Trees and highways, we'll certainly have a word with colleagues in E&T, but I do know that other councils, such as Northamptonshire, they do have an approved list of species which are acceptable in the highways. I think part of the problem is if you put blossom trees up, for example, they're going to make a mess. It's a maintenance issue, but there are certain trees which are suitable for highway planting, and we'll certainly liaise with colleagues in E&T to find out if they're willing to do that. Did I miss anything? Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Mr. Poland.
Thank you very much. Really just a couple of questions. First of all, pretty quick one, I think. Obviously, we can't take 106 for health reasons, because that's obviously the ICB that do that, and understand that adult social care obviously can't be because that sits separately. But it was interesting when it talks about revising the policy in regards to the health in all policies approach that we have as a council. I'm just thinking in terms of practicalities, what kind of things would we see in sort of future 106 requests as a result of that we wouldn't have seen before? So that's my first question. And the second one really is around highway infrastructure. Again, this is one of the larger bugbears in my part of the world. Development comes, but in reality, it doesn't come with supporting infrastructure to go along with it in a whole range of different ways, but including highways. So, you know, there are places like in Quenenborough, for instance, in my division, where you got a crossroads that's sort of 100 years old, and then it's just not built for modern traffic. And I wonder the questions are raised to what extent that's taken into account in Section 106 requirements beyond the immediate area of the development. So predicting more where the traffic is likely to go and the wider impact, and to what extent we then take 106 accordingly for that.
So I know I can definitely answer the first point on health in all policies. Obviously, this policy itself includes an element of public health. And we're discussing with public health exactly how they might wish to influence the policy, but that could be in areas such as sustainable and active travel, where they've identified potentially an issue in a particular area, and other things like that. I appreciate I'm not directly answering the question, but we are undergoing conversations with public health on exactly what that means.
I think it's very fair to say that the public health requirements will differ from site to site and area to area. They look at deprivation and various other health impacts when assessing the needs. So that I don't think we're going to have one solution fits all. I think it will vary a lot. In terms of highway infrastructure, we can only request Section 106 contributions to mitigate the impact of a development. We can't have them to sort of regularise existing deficits in the highway network. So we'll try as much as possible, but we have to be still compliant with seeking contributions.
Thank you for that, both. If I could just come back on that last point, I do understand that sort of it has to be to mitigate issues caused, but I guess my question would be, my point would be that we need to think maybe a bit wider, because obviously these cars aren't coming from nowhere, they're coming from the developments that are being built. So the developments are going up, and as a result the the problems are being worsened as a direct result of the development. So I think on that level, I think you could argue strongly that actually it is a problem, if not caused by, then certainly aggravated by development, and therefore potentially could come under Selden within 106.
I don't disagree with you. And what we are trying to do elsewhere, for example, in Charnwood, I've identified areas where we need transport improvements, and any site within that area would contribute to the wider improvements that are needed. So it's quite difficult to do that, because strictly speaking, you should be able to say, well, that site has that impact, but we're trying to look at it in a more cumulative way at the moment. So we'll see how that goes, and hopefully we can roll that out further.
Mr. Richardson.
Thank you, Chair. Just a few questions. You talked about the consultation. So I'd just like, I mean, I found the report extremely difficult to read and process, and I appreciate that's because I'm a bearer of very little brain. But I just wondered what the consultation is going to look like for residents to fully understand what they're being asked to consult on and other bodies. And if there is a draft copy of the consultation, is it something we could see a copy of, which might have made it clearer to us as members list committee? When it comes to some of the specific items, I mean, I look at the waste one, which I will confess I do not fully understand. But we're talking here about obviously household waste going to waste, not disposal sites, it's where it's processed, etc. Are we basing that solely on what is brought in by the collection authorities to us as the disposal authority? Are we also basing it on what individual residents take to those sites? And therefore, do the calculations take into account how often we would like those sites to be open rather than how often they are open? Because is there an opportunity here for extending hours as part of the increase in costs that we're asking developers to contribute? Because I think we all benefit if we have a site which is open 7 days a week, for instance, rather than a lot which are 5, if it were possible and could be funded by developers rather than ourselves, because we don't have the money. And are we also starting to think differently about waste outside the box? We've got new waste arrangements coming in 2026. We're going to have these weekly slot buckets, etc., everywhere in the world. So we're going to need, presumably, we're going to need access to our own biomass plants, etc. So are we starting to ask for contributions for, because it says here, as if I understood it correctly, that we can ask for contributions to deal with the waste in how we've got to deal with it, but we need to be ahead of the curve of what's coming in 2026 as opposed to what it is now? Or can we only do it when we get to 2026, if you're with me, rather than ask now? And it's always a learning curve, this one as well. I read the bit with libraries in interest, and a little fact leapt out to me there, which I'd never understood before or knew before, that each library should have 1,150 books for 1,000 residents in the area. Now, I chair adults community, so I probably should know because libraries comes under us, but I freely admit I don't. So do we know, do our libraries currently meet that criteria? Because if we don't know, perhaps it's something I might take back to adults communities, because we should be understanding that, so that you can say, we're below the stock, we need it upgraded. And when I take the library in my own division in Arbour, which is about the size of a bus shelter, I'm not actually convinced they could take the stock level requirement without an extension to the facilities, which will be almost impossible. So I'm not sure where we get to at that point when they can't meet the minimum government requirement for stock. Sorry, that's a lot of questions, but it's only because I'm genuinely interested.
I will try and answer all of those as well. So the actual consultation itself, what in terms of what will that look like online? So again, it's something that I'm working with colleagues in our comms team on. We're looking at the minute as a kind of plain English or easy read guide, and then questions based on that easy read guide. So in essence, a plain English guide of the appendix that you've already got, and then separate to that, an online consultation where it'll be asking questions of, please read section on libraries, for example. Do you agree with the proposal set out in the guide? Yes, no, unsure, and then an opportunity to give comments on each section of the appendix. And so that's in terms of the consultation itself. With reference to your question on the household and waste recycling centres, the contributions are based on not the refuse collection by the district authorities, but it's based on the waste that individuals take to those sites. And it's to be spent on the wider waste network, but it's capital infrastructure only, so not revenue or staffing costs. So I think in terms of your second point, can they be spent on keeping the sites open? I don't think so at this point. And yeah, so again, in terms of future proofing, so that the contributions are to be spent on managing the demand, whatever the demand looks like, and however it is that the waste service decide that they want to deal with or accommodate that demand. So that could include new technology as well. And then libraries. Do all of the libraries meet the current minimum stock levels? It's a good question, actually. I don't know, but I can check that with the library service. But what I can say is that we wouldn't ask for contributions towards libraries if those minimum stock levels were exceeded. Like you say, for Narborough Library, if there was no need to seek contributions. Sorry, yeah. But if there was no need to seek contributions for a particular library because it had sufficient stock to accommodate the demand from the development, then we wouldn't do that.
No, sorry, it's the other way around. I was saying if they don't meet the minimum requirements, if I understood this, it says we can ask for capital funding to extend the building.
Yes.
And it was a question of, are we making sure we do that? Because we don't know if we're meeting the minimum stock level requirements. We presumably aren't asking for a contribution when perhaps we should be, is where I was coming from.
Sorry, wrong way around.
Yeah, no, sorry, I probably wasn't clear. And on the consultation, I suppose it's always one of those things. I always feel that as a scrutiny committee, we should be seeing the draft consultation as part of the scrutiny process, so we can comment on what's going out to the public rather than perhaps just see it after it comes back. So I don't know if there's time for us to see the draft consultation before it goes out. It might be too late, but I always think it's useful for this committee to at least be able to opine on the look of the consultation, see if we can throw in any thoughts based on what we get back from our residents.
We will look at the timescales in terms of bringing the consultation responses back, consultation documentation back to you. We need to have this policy updated in place by September to allow education to seek contributions for new schools, etc. So that's the reason for the programme that we've put forward. But we can certainly make sure that in future we build enough time into the programme to bring anything to you for comment before we take it out for consultation.
Thank you, Mrs. Hack.
Thank you. Just a couple of things. Just following back on inflation. Obviously, lots of the reasons why things are running over budgets because inflation has been beyond what we would have anticipated. I know we can't account for that, but actually what we can account for is time lag. So, you know, we go through these processes and we know that school or that road won't be built for X number of years. How do we build in that time lag? Because we know that the policy books get updated in terms of the price per square foot or per square metre. So how do we deal with that? Going back to libraries, my division has a community library that's run by volunteers. How do they, are they still able to participate in the increase of book stock when they see an increase of residents in their community? So making sure that it's the 32 libraries as opposed to the 16 that are county run. How does that sort of play out? But those are the key things: is time lag, inflation. How do we do that? The last thing though is that we're also updating the development design guide in the highways and transport scrutiny. And actually, what reflections do we have in terms of 106 with regards to actually the design of developments, and how do those things fit together? Because I can't really see that, and I didn't know how they were referencing and work together as sort of key bits of policy with the authority.
Yeah, I'll do my best to answer those. Thank you. So first of all, in terms of the time lag, the contributions that we seek are indexed. So it's almost making today's money relevant tomorrow. Yeah, it's just that the indexation isn't quite there yet. So it's not quite covering the funding gap, which is another reason, of course, to be here and updating the policy itself. Secondly, your question about libraries. So we don't treat community libraries any differently to the LCC managed libraries. They're subject to the same contribution formula, the same demand. There's literally nothing that's different. Any contributions that we get for a community managed library go to the community managed library. So there's nothing different there. And in terms of the Leicestershire Highways Design Guide, it should fit hand in hand with this policy, and you'll see in the appendix actually I've been fairly vague because we're waiting for the Leicestershire Highways Design Guide to be updated. So I hope that answers those questions.
Mrs. Fryer.
Thank you. Back on the favourite thing of libraries, I'm very keen on libraries, and I think it's very important they do get funding, and I'm pleased to see that their contributions can be spent on stock, furniture, equipment. I wonder about this as 1,157 items of stock per 1,000 people in a library. Seems an awful lot of books in the modern era. And I know it's government policy, but it would be quite interesting to see somewhere along the line if this is highlighted too. And I have a community library in my own division. In fact, I have two in my division, community libraries. And I just wonder how much publicity is given to what they can spend, and then the advice they're given, particularly to the community libraries. Because if that's just going to be increased to £11.25, that's a lot of money. And I just wonder how these figures have materialised as 1,100 books per 1,000 people. I'm presuming that's in the total area. So for property, 200 houses being built, and they have to, if they don't meet that to get the 1,100 per person, per resident, or per property, depending on the size of the properties, you could have 5 people or 4 people. It's a bit woolly for the general public and for myself to understand how these figures are arrived at. I know it says it's dependent on the occupancy, etc., the assumed occupancy, which is not quite the same. And I just think this is going out for consultation. I think it needs to be so that I can go to my neighbour next door and say, do you understand this? And I do agree with Mr. Richardson that it would be useful if we could see consultation documents before they go out. You may find it, I'm sure the county would, people, the staff here would find it useful. We know our areas. We know what people can understand and not understand. When we can see the results of consultations we send out, results we get back are very low. They really are low. When you take the population of the county, and it's going out, the returns we get, not really very good. And I think and if it couldn't slot in with our next meeting because of your time scale, is there any problem that's being sent out to us by email with a cut-off date that you would like our comments by return? Because otherwise, to do it in this level, we may not have another document this detailed and to look at that has effect on residents as this one does. Thank you.
I know I can answer the specific point on libraries. So the formula is based on best practice guidance from the Department for Media, Culture and Sport. So we've kind of working on best practice. And then the cost of a book obviously fluctuates, and we've been asking for too little per book at £8.70, and that's why there's been that uplift. So we're kind of working on best practice guidance on this where we can. In terms of the consultation itself, then yes, I'm happy to provide a copy of that.
Consultation it's quite a technical consultation, so it may be we'll make it as easy as we can for people to comprehend and to understand, but I think the main consultation is based at the development industry, because we need them on board and then in agreement with what we're saying, so we don't get challenged when we start asking for costs. So there is going to be a technical element to the consultation that we just can't avoid, but we will make it as simple as possible and we will circulate it to you.
Mrs. Page.
Thank you. I have just quite a few points, but you've just answered my first one on the consultation. Whilst I am very keen on consultations being simple, so we get as many people without, but this is mainly featured towards developers who will be coming out in the drones and saying, no, we don't like that. You did say about the library, you answered my point, and it's based on culture and media. However, we need somebody who asked to be quite aware what they're doing, because I represent a small village. Everybody goes to Lutterworth. However, the last lot went to Hinckley, which caused an awful lot of aggravation because, you know, that wasn't looked at. So trees on the highways, again, I hear what you're saying, but at the end of the day, there needs to be also who will maintain them, how will they be maintained? Because as they grow older, they need more maintenance, and therefore there needs to be a long-term. You did say about bus services to make it long-term sustainable. Yes, but if we're talking 5 years, maybe that might be something, but it can't be forever. Once it is for 5 years and it then gets dropped, which are where I've been, then that falls and all of the negative impact on us as an authority. And I think that needs to be featured in. Now, Councillor Fryer did mention page 36, and I think most of us councillors totally agree with her. We do not know what a sustainable transport voucher is and how it will work, and personally I believe that page 36 should be dropped altogether and should be replaced with something like demand responsible transport, because unless I've missed it, there is no reference to demand responsible transport, which is you know, something that is vital in my communities to get old people to hospital and, you know, delivered to food banks. So demand responsive transport, I think, must feature in this. Now, my point in relation to this is my question rather, in order to secure all of this, how are we collecting the evidence, or have we got the evidence? Because everything's got to be evidence-based in order it is not challenged by the developer. So, you know, how do we do that? And then my next step is, because I have found this in my long time of sitting here, that, for instance, we've asked for bus stop improvement where there were no bus stops, or bus stops improvements and then the buses stopped running. But the worst was that we had monies but they weren't allocated. They got lost in the system. So in order to make this effective, so how do we go forward evaluating the process, the implementation, the monitoring by keeping proper records, so as an authority we get the best value out of the monies and you know, collecting them. And thank you very much.
Okay, I mean, I'll specifically come back on the point about how are we monitoring the income, and then Julie, if you want to come back on the other point. So try not to get too technical about it. So the planning obligations team, which is the team that I manage, there are 3 planning obligations officers, and we all look after a specific set of districts each, and then working in partnership with the districts and the developers and other departments across the county council is how we understand how a development's progressed through its life cycle, and we record all of that information in a centralised system that we've got that's called MasterGov. Now, the planning obligations process, both in terms of what we ask for and evidence gathering, has come on significantly over the last 2 or 3 years, as has the legal agreement monitoring side of the business as well. So we now keep everything within that central database. Everything is fully transparent, reportable. For those members of you that are familiar with Tableau, we're currently working on a Tableau process for you to get the information that you might need for your particular patches, whether that be income collected, secured or spent. We're working on that process. And
so can you also elaborate? So say, for instance, if the cutoff date is April 24, does the officer get an automatic ping or whatever? How will you know that the cutoff date is there coming up or whatever, in order to ensure that the money, you know, if it hasn't been called in, it's being called in?
Yeah, so we've recently gone over 300,000 lines of data and added in the earliest spend by date on every contribution that we have within the system, and officers are notified in a kind of red, amber, green sort of cascading mechanism. So contributions expiring within the next 6 months are sent separately, 12 months separately, and 18 months separately. So it's something that has been recently introduced, but again, it's all part of this Tableau offering, if you like, that we're putting out to officers. There's a lot more transparent.
And effective.
I hope so.
I must say that Mark and his team have done a really impressive job over recent years in bringing us up to speed. I'll admit in the past it was a bit hit and miss with Section 106 contributions, and certainly going forward it won't be like that anymore. And we are also starting to look at historically at Section 106 contributions, where perhaps we've actually implemented whatever infrastructure was required, but we've not collected the monies from the developer. So we are now going backwards as well as forwards to make sure that we've got a really robust system in place. Sustainable transport changes from week to week, day to day, what the definition is, but basically it's trying to get people away from cars and into walking and cycling, etc. So some of the vouchers that or some of the discussions we've been having is whether or not the voucher could be used to pay for a bicycle. You know, and it's just whatever we can do to change people's mindsets, to get them out of the motor vehicle and to get them into walking and cycling and wheeling, whatever they do. Demand responsive transport, great idea. The ones that I have seen that have been piloted haven't necessarily stood up sustainably in terms of being able to finance themselves and to run long term. So it's something we are looking at, but I think we just got to have a little bit of caution in how we look at it and how much we actually implement. And the evidence, we certainly need to have evidence for any contribution that we seek, and that is down to the individual services to put forward an evidence base to justify the contributions they're asking. If we can't justify it, we can't ask for it. So the emphasis is definitely on all the service areas to have that evidence base to back us up. We don't tend to get a lot of kickback from developers when it comes to waste and to library contributions because they're quite small amounts. What we find is they will argue the big ticket items, your education and your transport, etc. So we have to be even more robust in those areas to be able to push back and say, no, this is what we need, this is what you're generating, that's what you're going to contribute. So
if I may just come back, Julie, and thank you for that. I think that voucher issue, it does have to be revisited, because I hate to be adamant on something, because this green transport does not work, and we know that. But talking about evidence, have a look at the Lutterworth and the Broughton Astley, because that does work and it is really, really successful. And indeed, as you know, I spent my highways money to buy them 2 electric buses, and they could do with even more because they're that busy. And while I'm on that, I'm very keen on the first point, which was for adult social care. And I don't, adult social care to provide, hang on, let me get to it, to look at supported living accommodation. Now, some time ago, no, it's a long time ago, I was still in adult social care, we compiled a report to underpin that, and there was lots of evidence at the time that this is very highly required, even so. So there should be some reports and some evidence with Mr. Wilson in the department. Thank you.
Can I just say that what we're trying to do with adult social care is to influence local plans, so that any allocation that's coming forward has a site allocated for adult social care, because it does have a value. I mean, I know it's expensive for private individuals, but it does have a value to developers. So that's how we're trying to take that forward. I think when we do our full review in due course, then that's something we can look at and see whether or not we can include, but it all comes down to viability, as you know.
These reports were sent to the local authorities, and I assume you're working closely with all of the local planning authorities to make this sustainable.
Thank you. Any other comments, contributions from members? No. Okay. Well, thank you, Mark and Julie, for presenting and answering questions today. That brings, yes, Mr. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's move into private sector. So the date of the next meeting is scheduled to take place on Monday, the 10th of June at 10 a.m. There's no urgent items. Now I move on to a motion to exclude press and public. The next item to be considered in private. I therefore move under section 100A of the Local Government Act 1972, the public be excluded from the meeting during consideration of the following item of business on the ground that involves the likely disclosure of exempt information as defined in paragraphs 3 and 2 of part 1 of section 12A of the Local Government Act 1972. Is that agreed? Okay, so if we take a break for 5 minutes and see you then. All right, thank you.